Chapter 1 of The King's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The King's Daughter by Pansy. Chapter 1. Dell's Return Home. What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. She was dressed in a plain, neat, buff linen traveling suit, and looked fresh and comfortable, despite the heat and dust of the August day. She stood in the doorway of a village railway depot, tapping the toe of one neatly booted foot on the sill of the door, in a manner that might have betokened impatience or restlessness. Turning occasionally, she let her bright eyes rove over the ill-built, ill-kept, never-cleaned room, where luckless travelers were doomed to pass their waiting time, and her rosy lip curled in a scornful or disgusted way. Up the long, dusty hill leading to the depot buildings straggled a middle-aged man, with his hands in his pockets, and his straw hat on the back of his head. He quickened his pace a very little when he saw the fair picture framed in the doorway, and presently mounted the steps and stood before her, speaking in a tone that was half greeting and half surprise. "Well, and so you are really here!" The young lady thus addressed jumped down from the doorstep, and standing beside the man, reached up and touched two rosy lips to his hard, brown cheek, ere she answered: "Didn't you expect me, father?" And now it was your turn to be surprised. You would never have guessed the relationship. This little lady was so dainty and neat and graceful, and the man was so rough and coarse and ungainly. He answered his daughter's question with a half laugh, half grumble. "Oh, kind of, and kind of not. Your fine folks out there have so bamboozled you up, that I wasn't sure you would any of you remember that you had a father. Well, where's your luggage?" "Here are my checks. There are 2 trunks, and there's a little box besides. That's for you. Uncle Edward sent you some of grandma's choice books." "Thank you for nothing," the man said, gruffly. "We need 1,000 things more than we do books. Old rubbish, not worth paying to have 'em carried home. I've a good mind to leave 'em here to be used for firewood." The girl's bright eyes flashed, but she spoke in a cool, quiet tone. "If you can't afford to have them carried down, father, get a rope for me and bore a hole in the box, and I'll drag them home. I can, as well as not." Her father gave her a curious, puzzled look, but seemed to make nothing of her grave face. "Oh, I'll have them taken down," he said at last, "but I don't set any great store by 'em myself. Your Uncle Edward aired all the reading taste there ever was in our family. Here, you Bill Grimes," he added, raising his voice and beckoning to a man in the distance, with a cart, "just give me a lift here, won't you? My team is away today." The man drove around to the depot steps, and the two were busy about trunks and bundles, the young man giving the dainty maiden sly glances whenever chance favored him, until she turned toward him and said, with frank kindness: "How do you do, Mr. Grimes? You remember me, don't you?" Then he doffed his cap, awkwardly enough, while the red blood mounted to his very hair, and could go no further, even when the elder man put his hands on his fat sides and shook with laughter. "Mr. Grimes!" he ejaculated, when he could speak. "Now if that ain't the richest note!" And he went off into another laugh. "I reckon you ain't heard that name before since the old man died, have you, Bill? Come, come, Dell, you mustn't go to putting on airs here. You ain't down in Boston, now, you must remember." The imperturbable calm of the young girl's face, and the composure of her voice, seemed to awe her father into puzzled silence. She only said: "I shall certainly try to call people by their right names, father, here in Lewiston, just as I would anywhere else." Her father's next remark was made when the last trunk was securely strapped to the cart. "Now we're ready. I guess you and I will jog on ahead, Dell." And the walk through the long, dusty, sleepy village streets was commenced. The houses straggled at irregular and uncertain intervals on either side of the street, and every single one of them looked as though the paint had been worn off by the 3rd generation back. There were blinds hanging by one hinge, suggestive of many a delicious creak and groan, when once the November wind had fair play among them. In the center of this delightful old town there stood a great square, weather-worn, sorrowful-looking wooden barn, named by courtesy a church. This seemed to be the climax to the forlorn picture, and to Dell Bronson's Boston accustomed eyes, Only her heart could tell how forlorn it all seemed. Her father, glancing furtively up at the still creature beside him, saw the wondering gaze that she cast about her, and questioned: "How does it all look? Natural like?" "It looks," said Dell, speaking slowly, and with great gravity, "as though all the people had gone away 200 years ago, and never came back, and must have been glad of it ever since." "Ha, ha, ho, ho!" chuckled the father. "You're a cute one, I guess. That's pretty good." And then they had reached their home. Home! No, the wooden church had not been the climax after all. It was here in this long, low, once yellow painted, now dirt begrimed, wooden shuttered, broken windowed village tavern, with dirty piazzas running the entire length of the building, garnished with 5 wooden chairs, on which chairs lounged 5 of the most disgusting creatures that ever tilted back on the piazza of a third-rate hotel, and smoked, and chewed, and spit, and stared. "Well, here you are, home at last," the father said, as he pushed open the great yellow door. Home! Was it actually her home? She shivered a little, not outwardly, and sped up the uncarpeted stairs without letting herself glance at any of the objects inside of that door. The room into which she ushered herself was long and narrow. In one corner stood a single bedstead, on which was mounted a feather bed, suggestive of a sweltering night, and the finishing touch was a blue and green patchwork quilt, put on crooked. It was an indication of this girl's character that before she took off her hat and sack, or even her gloves, she walked over to the bed and straightened the quilt, tucking it neatly in at the sides, and then drawing it out again, because, on the whole, it looked less forlorn drooping over the sides than it did to have it hidden away, thereby revealing the long, narrow, ungainly rails. Then she shook up the mites of pillows, and turned down the sheets in a dainty way. So much, ere she took in the rest of the room. There was little enough to see. A queer, old-fashioned, twisted-legged table, a square wooden washstand with the paint worn off, and with one leg shorter than the others, so that it toddled whenever it was touched, making a racket over the nicked washbowl and dingy pitcher. 3 chairs, one a dingy rocker, with a pitiful green and purple cushion on the seat. These completed the furnishing of the room, except, indeed, a faded red and green and yellow carpet, which in its best and brightest days could not have been pretty. Dell untied the white cord that fastened the blue paper window curtain almost to the ceiling, and shut out the glaring sun, then went to the 10-inch looking-glass, and unfastened her hat, taking a grave, earnest look at her round, young face, with its rosy cheeks and great bright eyes. Not so bright but that one could detect a touch of sadness in their brown depths. She sighed again, just a little touch of a sigh, quickly caught and suppressed, but there were visions of a little white and green room, in which she had stood only yesterday at this time. Such a gem of a room, just those 2 colors, from the mossy carpet that pressed her feet, to the tiny sea-green bedstead in its dress of perfect white. Her own room it had been for several years. Uncle Edward's home, and Aunt Laura's, but none the less it had seemed hers. As she brushed her hair she thought about it all. Years and years ago, a lifetime ago it seemed to her, Uncle Edward had come and carried her away from this very room to her own green and white one in Boston. 7 years ago. Why, was it only 7? Yes, for she was almost 11 years old, and now last month she was 18. She remembered the morning very well, and the weeks before that morning, and especially that one day in which her mother died; that white, tired mother, who never wore other than the sad, patient, gentle face in the midst of all her discouraging surroundings, and how discouraging they were! Dell was just beginning to have a faint gleam of an idea. Well, one day, suddenly, unexpectedly, after lying for some weary weeks on a high bed in a dreary room, having very little company in her loneliness, and Dell suspected now anything but proper care, the burden of living was dropped, and for the first time in many years the tired woman rested, body and heart and brain. Dell remembered it all, remembered especially the solemn funeral, and how frightened and dreary the father looked, and how her tall, pale-faced Uncle Edward seemed to her to belong to another race of human beings. After the funeral, Aunt Nancy, her father's sister, came to live with them, and assume the endless cares of the dead woman, and Uncle Edward went back to his city home, taking Dell with him. She was his only sister's only child, and had been to him in all respects as his own, never really given up to him by her father, yet the years had slipped by; and save once when she was nearly 14, and had come to stay a week with her father, and had quarreled with Aunt Nancy in 3 days and been sent back to Boston, she had never left the beautiful home of her adoption, where she had been the carefully nurtured and much petted darling. By degrees it had nearly gone out of her life, the remembrance of any other home, until one day there had come a letter from her father, an unusual thing, for he was not given to letter writing. This one was brief, but startling. Thus it was in detail: "Dear Dell, this is to tell you that your Aunt Nancy is dead. She died 3 months ago, very sudden. Since which I have rubbed along alone, and it has been pretty rubbing work. What, with all the sass of the girls and breaking things, I'm sick of it. If it so be that you are a mind to come home and do your duty by your father, why I'll be glad to see you, and will do my duty by you; but I shan't lay no commands on you. Them that has you, and has done for you, maybe thinks they has the best right to you, and if so be that you think so too, why, so be it. If you decide to come, write and let me know, and I'll come to the cars and get you. Your obedient servant, Jonas P. Bronson." This signature, not for any intended sarcasm, but from a vague memory that the few letters that he had been called upon to write closed in that manner. Dell read this letter in the little summer parlor in Boston, standing leaning one arm on her piano, her white dress floating airily around her; read at first to herself, with the startled, shocked look on her face, settling into one of such marked pain that the fair-faced woman, sitting in the low rocker by the window, said: "What is it, my darling?" And Dell passed the letter to her without a word. Now the next few sentences will tell you how this young girl had been nurtured, and upon what principles her actions were founded. The lady read the letter, and then said, in quick, pained tones: "Oh, my darling child!" And Dell, still standing there, beside her beloved piano, said in a firm, clear voice: "Aunt Laura, when do you think I ought to go?" A few minutes later, when Uncle Edward had joined them, he said, inquiringly: "There is no question as to your duty in this matter, Dell." And she, raising her grave, earnest eyes to his face, answered: "Is there any room for doubt, Uncle Edward?" "Will you tell me, my dear child, what thought you have in your heart that decides the matter for you so promptly?" And the young girl, with eyes drooping and fast filling with great tears, still answered steadily: "Honor thy father and thy mother." So here she was in that long, narrow room, brushing her hair before the 10-inch glass. Is it a wonder she sighed a little over the contrast? But Dell Bronson was not a girl that was much given to sighing. She gave some energetic twists to her wavy hair, and then addressed herself aloud, which she was rather in the habit of doing: "It isn't a palace, by no means, but then it is my father's house, and I shall live in it, and be happy besides, if there is any such thing." With the expression, "my father's house," a bright smile broke over her face, and she repeated, aloud and slowly: "In my Father's house there are many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you." Oh, Dell Bronson, you must not forget that your father's house is a palace, and that you are a king's daughter. Never mind the place in which you may have to stay for a little while, just to make your preparations, you know. There are a great many things to do. Meantime, Bill Grimes had appeared with her trunks, and they had been brought up to her room; so diving into the depths of one of them, she produced therefrom a white daintily ruffled apron, and tying it on she ran gaily downstairs, more gaily than she felt, to conceal an aching desire at her heart for a loving greeting from somebody. Oh, for a mother to clasp tender arms about her! She felt young to begin life alone. Yet at that moment there came a bright memory to her heart, of one who loved her with a love passing that of women. She remembered his eternal promise: "As one whom his mother comforteth, so will I comfort you." And the gaiety had toned down into a steady, sweet brightness by the time she opened the dining room door. End of Chapter 1. Recording by TriciaG.